Okay, as the Europeans settle in these places, what does it look like? How does the social setting look? Okay, so we'll emphasize Java here and India. Society did have racial discrimination. Early in the game, in the 1700s, there is definitely a feeling of racial superiority among the Europeans, but it's not as intense as it will become later. Not as intense. And that's what point number two is there. There was also mixing of the races between Europeans. Mostly in the beginning it's men who colonize, men who colonize. But what will happen over time is they will start to bring in more European women. That's point number three here. And European women demand the men to have less contact with Asian women. They don't want their men hanging out with those Asian women. So one of the things that happens is as there's less contact between the races, you can probably guess what happens to racism because of that. That's right. It's going to increase. It's harder to make negative general statements about people you know real well. In other words, it's easier to make stereotypes of people when you only know a few people from a certain group or you don't really know very many. It's easier to do that. But when they have a lot of contact early, there's less of that discrimination. Okay? Next up, one of the things they try to do is the British in particular try to reform India. What do? Well, they push for education. They try to educate people. Now, this is going to have an ironic impact. Notice this push for education. It's going to make an ironic impact. The ironic impact is that as they educate native people from South Asia and India to take care of themselves, they're going to want to become more and more independent. You'll hear me say this again later on, but Gandhi is going to come in and lead the Indian independence movement. And Gandhi was actually educated as a lawyer in England. They'll push for the English language to be used, particularly because the argument here goes that the English language has more scientific words in it and is more scientific language, and people need to learn that language so that when you're dealing with science, you are speaking, everyone understands the same terms. There's an infusion of Western technology, railroads, telegraphs, weapons, iron making, steel making, all these kind of things. And one of the things they try to get rid of is they try to get rid of sati, which they outlaw in the 1830s, and there's a picture of it here, which was the idea that upper class Hindu woman, upper class Hindu woman was supposed to throw herself on her husband's fire in order to cremate herself while still alive with her husband. And the British found that practice repulsive and tried to outlaw it. Okay, what kind of changes resulted in India? We see, I'd like you to write down the four. On number three, you only have to write down the first part that's underlined there. But Western ideas, inventions, modes of organization, and technology are brought in. Modes of transportation. We talked about railroads, some of their inventions, their technology, and their organization. India gets drawn into the global trade network. Schools model behavior on European exercise, reading, scientific learning. So very much modeled on European style. And ironically, the values taught to Indians are later used against the British. These values of individual freedom, individual importance are brought back and eventually come back to bite the Europeans. Because they'll say, well, do you really believe that? Or are you just saying that? Because if you believe that, then you got to start treating us, the people from India, you got to start treating us better. And here on the right, I've got a picture of one of the British families from this time period, from the imperial time period, and with their nice, notice he's dressed just like his father, and they've got the colonial dress. All right. Industrial rivalries and the partition of the world from the late part of this time period. What are the results of colonial expansion? Now, what I mean by this question is, what are the results or the reasons for colonial expansion? Reasons for colonial expansion of the European states. And the first one is that by having more colonies, it gives you greatest status, and status is a great power. In other words, you can say, the British used to brag, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they had, think about it, Australia, okay, they had India, they had parts of the Middle East, and England, of course, itself, they had Canada, and so the sun was always shining on some part of the British Empire. So that gave you a great status as a great power. Raw materials. These colonies supplied raw materials for the industrialization of these European countries. As Germany and England and France and Belgium take off, they need supplies of raw materials. Also, these places provide markets for manufactured goods. They need these to keep their economies growing. European countries are suffering from overproduction. In other words, they're producing too many goods, and unemployment. So if they want to keep people working and want to keep things good, they've got to supply material. They've got to have markets. This should sound familiar to us. Remember us talking about core and dependent nations? Do you remember that? Core and dependent nations? So it should sound familiar to you. And also, colonies could be destinations for the unemployed and, in the case of Australia, some petty criminals. They used it as a penal colony, a place to store prisoners during this time period. Okay? So market for surplus goods, colonies could provide some place for the unemployed. The idea was in Britain that if we could just ship the poor and some of these petty criminals off someplace, we could rid Britain of crime forever. We get rid of those people, because the belief was at this time that crime was a result of the individual and not of the way society was structured. We now know it's some combination thereof, but that was the way it was at this time. Okay, we're halfway through chapter 24. We'll stop and take a little break and then come back.